I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to present a paper at this meeting. I'm going to talk about Lønt, 2 types of megaliths and 1 oddball dolmen. Megalithic monuments are a particular type of architecture that embody or materialize different aspects of a belief and thought system. Megalithic tombs are also ritual buildings erected to connect the tangible world of the living with the intangible world of the spiritual forces. This paper will consider the architecture of a megalithic cemetery called Lønt, located on the south shore of Haderslev Fjord in southeastern Jutland, not far from the German border. I'll argue that choices in design and raw materials express social identity. Second, I'll present an unusual dolmen at the site. I'll then argue that the accessibility of the monuments and the complexity of rites materialized in the architecture indicate a change in the funerary ceremonies and in the relationship between the living and the dead. A change in the social dynamics toward a more competitive social environment is reflected in the increased investment in the labor monuments. The Lønt megaliths are located in an area rich in megalithic tombs. 250 tombs are recorded in the region. At Lønt, a tight cluster of 11 tombs form a separate megalithic cemetery with a maximum distance between any 2 tombs of 180 meters. In comparison, the 3 nearest megaliths in the area are located about 1.5 and 3 kilometers away. The cemetery itself is divided into 4 subgroups. The structures are located on gentle elevations in the landscape without any indication that the topography dictated the spatial arrangement of the tombs. I'll designate these subgroups as the north, the middle, and the south group, and an eastern passage grave. The northern group is made up of 2 round dolmens and a passage grave. The middle group, a similar combination of tombs, was built in the middle group. The central grave is a so-called oddball dolmen that I'll speak more about later. The southern group of tombs started out with 2 round dolmens, one with a sealed chamber and one with a dolmen with a passage. Later on, a gross dolmen and a small passage grave were added at each end of the group. It is unclear in what order this happened, but eventually all 4 tombs were integrated into one large monument. The 4th unit at Lønt is a passage grave placed centrally in a long mound and located by itself at some distance from the other tombs. The slides are moving by themselves for me here. The chronology of the cemetery is based on the typology of the chambers and in part on pottery styles. The first construction at the cemetery begins in the late early Neolithic between 3,500 and 3,300 BC, with the building of 2 tombs in the northern group and 1 tomb in the middle group. During the period MNA1A, the Trollebjerg phase, around 3,250 BC, 2 more tombs were added, 1 in the middle group and the first grave in the southern group. Finally, in MNA1B, the Klintebakke phase, between 3,200 and 3,100 BC, 5 or approximately 6 chambers with a passage are constructed. The immediate visual impression of the cemetery is that of an entity with 4 subdivisions. The most obvious interpretation of this spatial pattern is that the cemetery as a whole and the individual units reflect 2 levels of social organization. This assumption is supported by micro-traditions in the architecture. Features that characterize the entire cemetery include all entrances are oriented between south, southeast, and south. All the chamber floors are sunken into the ground between 0.2 and 0.5 meters. All chambers are sealed with drywall, including the dolmens. All of the packings surrounding the chamber include clay, either pure clay or a combination of clay, stones, and flint. None of these features are unique to Lønt. They are within the range of building techniques and materials normally used for megalithic construction in Denmark. However, similar selections of raw materials for the packings only occur at 11% of these megaliths. Finally, all floors are made with burnt flint, supplemented in a few chambers with red sandstone tiles and clay. The same choice of floor materials is only found at a third of Danish megaliths. Similar local traditions in the choice of floor materials are also found in the northern Germany, as Martin told us earlier. A couple of architectural features relate to only one of the subgroups at Lønt. Probably the strongest expression of group identity is the integration of all 4 tombs in the southern group into one big monument. A local building tradition is seen exclusively at the southern group, involving a step down of about 0.5 meter at the entrance of the chamber. Usually the floor of the passage and the chamber meet at about the same level, but here there's a difference of about 0.5 meter at either side of the threshold stone that mark the transition between the passage and the chamber. This special design is related to the interior of the tombs, invisible to the outside world, and perhaps only known to the builders and users of the tombs. Only a few other Danish megaliths have a similar entrance to the chamber. In addition, a rare phenomenon appears in the form of sidewalks of crushed flint surrounding 2 of the tombs in the north group. A stone layer around the third tomb might represent a similar pavement or a collar of stones from the original mound surface. Thus, interior design features, as well as the exterior of the tombs and the choice of raw materials, are expressions of identity, both at the level of the subgroups, but also an indication of a shared cemetery-wide identity. The monument centrally located in the middle subgroup, the one that I call the oddball dolmen, is an unusual tomb because it combines features of both megalithic and non-megalithic graves, as well as cult houses. This dolmen appears to be a transitional structure between wood and stone constructions, but also between 2 funerary ceremonies. The chamber was sealed and about 5 square meters in size. It was constructed of 8 stones, 2 on each side, and had a floor made of clay, red sandstone tiles, and white burnt flint. Grave goods included a polished flint axe, a transverse arrowhead, a braid knife, and a couple of amber beads, as well as a few potsherds. The chamber was surrounded by a 1 meter thick wall of pure clay and surrounded by a low mound and a circle of stones 8 meters in diameter. A wooden fence was detected about 2 meters outside of the stone circle. In the area between the stone circle and the fence, about 29 pots were placed at regular intervals in a ring around the tombs. The location of these pots is marked with white paper plates in the photo. Some of these pots were pedestal bowls in Trollebjerg style, dating the tomb to MNA 1A. Remnants of a circular hut-like structure with wattle and daub walls surrounded the chamber on top of the low mound. The wall was evidenced by a narrow trench with traces of woodwork and lumps of daub and raw clay. A patch of charcoal with a radiating structure was interpreted as part of a straw roof, but could also be part of the wall structure. 3 fragments of burned flint axes were found inside the structure. The hut-like structure was eventually burned down, and finally a pile of sand and a stone pavement covered the entire site. Apparently the tomb was forgotten already in the Neolithic. The north side of the structure was disturbed by the construction of a passage grave immediately to the north. When other megaliths at Lønt were recorded in the 19th century, this tomb likewise went undetected. It was only discovered in relation to the excavation of the neighboring passage grave in 1988. The original excavator interpreted all the features as part of one monument. However, it's difficult to verify the non-lithic structures. Also, a stone color that is asymmetrical in relation to the circular curbstones suggests that there might be a younger phase of the monument. The wattle and daub structure could be part of this younger phase. Circular wooden structures, but more substantial, are found in relation to some graves from the battle axe culture. Circular structures are likewise found in relation to some late Neolithic and Bronze Age mounds. Neither period is represented among the finds from this monument. Conceivably, the structure was built in relation to later burials in a neighboring passage grave, but it would be a strange coincidence that a much later construction would be built right on top of this chamber. A date similar to the chamber is also supported by the type of the burned flint axe fragments found inside the circular structure. So probably the hut-like structure and the dolmen chamber are part of the same monument. The original excavator has provided two different interpretations of the tomb, either as a purely megalithic chamber covered by one or more capstones, or as a stone chamber with a hut as the actual roof. The interpretation of the dolmen as a hybrid stone and wood construction seems more appealing. It is difficult to see the purpose of enclosing the capstones in a hut. The lack of capstones and a proper mound also makes it easier to explain why this monument was overlooked both in the Neolithic and later. The circular shape of the hut is peculiar and remains a mystery. Laporte and Trinevé in 2004 have suggested that domestic houses and grain silos might at certain times be the model of houses for the dead. However, contemporary domestic houses are oval to rectangular, and the cult houses are square. The grain silo model also finds no other example in Danish Neolithic. Asarv, wattle and daub structures are only found at a few ovens, but not at grain silos. The circular pattern of the pottery deposition is likewise unusual, but found at other tombs at Lønt. The combination of a sealed chamber and pottery offerings is beyond the norm. Pedestal bowls especially are primarily related to rites at passage graves and cult houses. The combination of a stone-built chamber and a house-like structure is somewhat similar to the combination of megaliths and cult houses at places such as Tustrup. However, placement of the hut-like structure on top of the chamber is also reminiscent of temporary wooden structures found in relation to early Neolithic graves at earthen long barrows. Like these structures, the hut-like structure most likely represent a liminal phase in the funerary ceremonies. The liminal period, while the spirit of the dead still lingered among the living, might have lasted as long as the hut was standing. Burning of the hut and sealing of the site with a payment indicate the severance of the dead from the living and their integration into the other world. The destruction of the house and sealing of the site with a dirt and stone pavement is identical to the final sealing found at some earthen long barrows and at the cult houses. In conclusion, this tomb appeared to be a transitional form, both in terms of the construction and the funerary rites, between non-megalithic graves from the early Neolithic and megalithic tombs from the first period of the Middle Neolithic period. Differences in accessibility to the monuments and the complexity of architecture suggest that the Lønt tombs can be divided into three groups. A group of single rectangular chambers without a passage, a group of larger chambers with a passage, and the oddball dolmen, and possibly one more chamber, are transitional structures. A group of 4 monuments have small rectangular chambers with a floor area 1.5 to 2.2 square meters. These chambers have no passage. They may be sealed, but most were semi-open with a high threshold stone at one end of the chamber. The size of the floor area and lack of any structural division of the floor indicate that the entire floor was intended for funerary purposes. Access to the chamber was from above. After the burial in the chamber, adding a capstone and a mound encircled by a row of stones marked the removal of the dead from the world of the living. Pottery depositions were made after the final stage of construction when the monument was completed. The regular pattern of a circular pots along the perimeter of the mound found at 2 monuments at Lønt suggests that this was a one-time event, possibly celebrating the integration of the dead into the other world. The primary function of these modest monuments was as a place of burial. The sequence of funerary ceremonies and of the monument construction seems to be brief and continuous. Only 2 ritual zones are used, the funerary area in the center and the ceremonial area around the perimeter of the mound. Activities in both of these zones were public, in the sense that the central zone would be visible to mourners in a funerary party, and later attendance at the grave would be visible to the public in general. The second group of monuments include 5 tombs with a passage and larger chambers covering between 4.5 and 8 square meters. The greater size and the presence of subdivisions of the floor area indicate a differentiation of the funerary functions. Combined with the permanent access through the passage, this suggests that the chambers were intended not only for funerary purposes, but also for worship and offerings. Though access was always possible, the long, narrow crawls through a passage marked with intermittent thresholds show, however, that the dead were in general supposed to be left in peace. Probably only a selected group of people were in charge of the continued relationship with the dead, and perhaps the use of relics in materializing the memory of the dead. A couple of architectural features reveal multi-stage construction of some or all of these monuments. The perimeter of the packing around 3 chambers was lined with bigger stones. The use of larger stones could be a means of stabilizing the packing, but it might also be a kind of embellishment of the packing if the chamber had been left freestanding for a period of time. At 2 passage graves, an interior circle of smaller stones was placed around the chamber in the area that was later covered by a mound. Similar concentric stone circles have been found at several other Danish passage graves at different levels in the mound. Different explanations have been offered. The stone circles might be a means to control the process of different stages of mound construction, as well as stabilizing the mound. The example here is from Klækkenehøj, where a stepwise mound construction is kept in place by payments of smaller stones and circles of larger stones. A less functional and more ritual purpose is suggested at other tombs. At Århus 3, 2 circles of burned timber logs surrounded the chamber. And we have heard about the passage grave at Damsbo Mark, where pottery depositions were made at 3 concentric stone circles surrounding the chamber. Burning of timber logs and deposition of pottery suggest that these circular structures were not only a functional aspect of construction, but were features incorporated in the ceremonies related to sanctifying the monument or to funerary rites, perhaps during a liminal period similar to the period marked by the hut-like structure on top of the oddball dolmen. The duration of these intermediate stages in the construction might be short-lived, but the formation of A horizons on these buried surfaces at some monuments suggests a more lengthy period of time at some monuments. After a certain period of time, the monuments were completed with a mound and a circle of curbstones, similar to the smaller monuments. Large pottery offerings were deposited at the entrance, and sometimes opposite the entrance and toward the east as well. At some tombs, a ceremonial area around the mound perimeter is defined by a sidewalk of crushed flint or a circle of smaller stones, the same way a wooden fence marked the area around the oddball dolmen. I should say that the circle of smaller stones to the right also could mark the limit of a second and larger mound from the late Neolithic. The multi-stage construction process shows that both the monuments and probably the ceremonies related to these tombs have become more prolonged and complex. The architecture of these monuments embodies change in relation between the living and the dead by creating a permanent passage from the world of the living to the spiritual world. At the same time, the secluded character of the chamber, perhaps reinforced by the interior and exterior stone circles, created an increased spatial distance between ordinary people and the tombs. Deposition of the dead was no longer public. Demarcations of the ceremonial area around the mound suggest that access to this ritual zone was now limited as well. Most likely, knowledge of the funerary ceremonies had become more restricted, just as a more select segment of the population might have been buried at the larger tombs. A similar trend toward more elitist monuments is seen in the work effort invested in the different monuments. The work effort has been analyzed by comparing the area in square meters of the chamber itself, the packing around the chamber, and the area covered by the mound. The graph shows the tombs aligned according to chamber size. Sorting by size separate the tombs according to types of chamber and to some degree chronologically. The simple rectangular dolmens are to the left, and the later passage graves to the right, and a hybrid oddball dolmen somewhere in the middle. The expectation was that increased chamber size would be associated with similar increases in the size of the packing and the mound. However, a surprising zigzag pattern affects this general trend. A more transparent pattern appears when the data are sorted according to subgroup at the cemetery. Both in the northern and the middle group, a regular pattern of increasing size is found in relation to all three parameters, and both groups show a radical increase in the investment in mound size in relation to the passage graves. The long mound erected in relation to the eastern passage graves, shown far to the right, exceeds all others in terms of work effort invested in the monument of a single tomb. No doubt this is the most costly monument at Lønt. The southern group, on the other hand, achieved monumentality through the close spatial association of the tombs, and instead resources were spent on erecting one more chamber than the other groups. Aside from the similar floor designs mentioned earlier, this low-cost strategy of achieving monumentality is another example of the shared values among the builders of the southern tombs. Construction at the Lønt Cemetery shows two different strategies in achieving monumental appearance. One is focused on size and enhancing the tombs through a demarcation of the outer perimeter. The other strategy is based on agglomeration of smaller tombs into one large monument. Both strategies indicate that an impressive exterior appearance of the monument had become more important at the time when the passage graves were built. In contrast, the modest mounds of the earlier tombs show that the primary concern then was achieving a megalithic burial. Perhaps the location at the cemetery was significant as well. This change in perspective suggests a situation of increased social rivalry in society during the final period of construction at the cemetery. The sequence of expansion at the cemetery is still tentative as no C14 datings are available and pottery analyses are ongoing. However, the final construction period at Lønt seemed to represent a short-term burst of activity in M&A 1B, following the earlier, more gradual growth of the cemetery. In 2010, Chris Scar suggested that the building of megaliths could be a sequence of short-term events rather than a continuous process. Construction at Lønt might very well fit this description, certainly in the final period of construction. In addition to the building of new monuments during the Klintebakke phase, burials are still being placed in almost all of the old tombs as well. This is a period of intense celebration of the ancestors. The megalithic architecture at Lønt embodies a number of different aspects of social dynamics in Neolithic society, as well as beliefs about relations to the dead and the other world. The continued expression of two levels of social identity during the construction of the cemetery suggests a remarkably stable and long-term structure for the social groups involved with the cemetery. The three subgroups are uniformly built up of two round dolmens and a passage grave. One group has an extra late chamber. We have seen a similar lasting burial tradition in terms of local subgroups in the area around Saab. At the Lønt cemetery, only the eastern passage grave represents dramatic change in the stable tripartite structure. Either a new group or a splinter group, or perhaps a final unification of the three subgroups, was behind the most impressive monument in the cemetery. A gradual build-up of the cemetery appears to have been succeeded by a burst of construction within a relatively short period of M&A 1B, suggesting that the monument building became increasingly competitive and an arena of social rivalry. The scaled-up labor investment involved in the passage graves from period 1B reflect a similar competitive trend towards more impressive monumentality. At the same time, changes in the architecture implied that the funerary rites became less visible and less public, as well as more complex, perhaps involving a liminal period. Such change indicates a different relationship between the living and the dead, but also that the use of the megalithic tombs had become more selective. Interestingly, the investment of resources in the causeway enclosures might be reduced at the same time. At Saab, only a fifth of the workforce was required to build the second enclosure, contemporary with the large megalithic tombs, than was used to build the first enclosure. Accordingly, the construction of megaliths and celebration of ancestors must have become the prime means of legitimizing power in this increasingly stratified society. The architecture of the megaliths had become the sublime expression of power and permanence in both the world of the living and in the other world. Even today, okay, I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention to this final paper of the meeting.